Hello, everybody. And welcome to Data Collection, Storage, Computational Analysis, and Researcher Tools for Early Learning Analytics at PBS Kids. I'm Jeremy Roberts, Technology Principal at The Incredible Pair. So let me lead off here with an overview and a little context setting. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about PBS Kids and the PBS Kids mission. Next, I'll tell you a little bit about the Ready to Learn initiative that we're working on currently. From there, I'm going to try and give you a sense of scale for the PBS Kids audience. And with that, I can jump into the Progress Tracker project goals and partners. And then I plan to spend some time talking about the platform we've been cooking up, give you a look at the tools that we've decided that we need, and then take a quick minute to look towards the future of our own efforts. The PBS Kids mission. Generally, PBS Kids wants to be wherever the kids are with responsible and high quality educational media experiences that kids love and that parents trust. And that's why PBS Kids makes content for TV, DVD, web, tablet, pocket device, interactive whiteboards, and more. And these days there's always new and interesting distribution platforms to explore all the time, from kid-targeted tablets to like the Fuhunabi to the growing capabilities of the open web stack and technologies like Unity and so on. And generally, PBS Kids wants to be there to make a positive educational impact and help the kids grow. Next, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Ready to Learn initiative, which I commonly refer to as RTL, of which the PBS Kids Progress Tracker is about one piece. PBS, in cooperation with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and with funding from the United States Department of Education, is exploring the use of transmedia approaches to producing educational media. Which, by the way, Sarah DeWitt, Vice President of PBS Kids Digital, will be talking a little bit more about later tonight at dinner. The Ready to Learn project is a 5-year effort to help kids ages 2 to 8 learn math using educational media in a variety of settings. It's developed a math curriculum framework to serve as the curricular foundation for the effort. And by the time it's done, it will have produced 2 brand new television programs, over 100 games, dozens of offline activities to take play and learning into the real world. And additionally, the project has conducted all sorts of experiments into media approaches, from augmented reality to 3D online rendered multiplayer experiences and more. Frankly, the RTL project itself is a much larger talk in and of its own right. But I want to give you at least a glimpse into some of the content we're making. This is Curious George's Busy Day, everyone's favorite monkey. This suite has 16 games in it. And of course, Cat in the Hat knows a lot about that. Cat's Math Safari is awesome. There's nine games here. And PBS Kids' newest preschool television series, Peg Plus Cat, is accompanied by 11 interactive experiences currently, with another suite on the way. And this is really just scratching the surface. There's much, much more. Next, you can see a quick glimpse of our skill coverage with the content we've been producing. Generally, there's between 6 and 12 games per skill right now, and a number of supporting related offline activities. And here's a quick glance at the 6 to 8 age range. And I think it's worth noting that inside each of these skill buckets are dozens of sub-skills, each of which in our math curriculum framework are expressed behaviorally. These are very specific capabilities. For example, something like use number lines to place, order, and identify missing numbers up to 29, say for 5-year-olds, or maybe up to 50 for 6-year-olds, things like that. So one takeaway here is that there's a substantial producer pipeline in action to be able to make all this content. This is the PBS Kids producer community. And at PBS Kids, the same producers that make the TV show are involved in all things digital, and so there's coherent strategies, educational and media strategies across all platforms and media types. The other key takeaway is that all of the educational media that we're producing as part of the project target well-defined math skills laid out by our project's curriculum framework. Next, let's take a quick look at scale of audience. And this has real implications for potential for impact and scaling educational content. So 12 million unique visitors come to the website per month, 320 million video streams per month. So far in 2014, we've had 1.4 million app downloads, and since 2011, 9 million app downloads. So we knew that if we were going to start talking about learning analytics and data collection and analysis, that we'd need a plan to grapple with the scale from the get-go. Okay, so what is the PBS Kids Progress Tracker? Well, here's the top level abstract view. You can see the kids, the center of the circle on the left, playing on any supported content or device, logging in with the PBS Kids account system, but you don't have to log in. You can play anonymously if you want. And gameplay is transmitted to a collector and it's analyzed, all to help PBS Kids and game producers and researchers explore the way that the games are being used with the goal of improving their educational impact. So what do we mean when we talk about learning analytics in the context of this project? We mean looking very carefully at each of the individual experiences, defining the salient features that relate to educational content, mapping the entire space of interaction possibilities for each of those pieces of content, instrumenting those pieces of content to collect very granular pieces of information around interaction, and then we layer on the meaning later in a flexible way that allows us to experiment with how meaning is derived as we get better and better at it over time. And along the way, we're trying to solve any of the obstacles that we bump up against that make it difficult, slow, or expensive for our game producers and our learning experts to explore and experiment with their own ideas in the space. So to describe the project in terms of its own goals, collect all the data, first and foremost, collect all the data safely and responsibly. That's right up front. Support many different media types and formats and platforms, and keep the data around for an extended period of time so that we can continue to learn from it for the lifetime of the product, and break down any barriers we can to scientific exploration. To describe the project in terms of the project partners, we've got PBS Kids, who commissions the project, provides executive leadership, and by virtue of the amazing producer community, produces all the content. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting oversees our third-party formative and summative research that looks into the efficacy of our content. They also help manage outreach efforts through the PBS member stations. The United States Department of Education provides the funding opportunity. UCLA CRESST helps us with deep expertise into measurement, assessment, and game-based learning. ExcelSoft provides engineering and software development services, and WestEd has helped us with some early studies into the platform. And the incredible pair, I help with technical direction and strategy, and generally try to help coordinate all the parties. So here's a slightly less abstract version, representation of the platform. Again, starting on the left, you have the kids, maybe logging in with the identity services or playing anonymously, interacting with the content, sending the data to a collector, which activates the processing layer. And as the data comes in, the jobs are queued up to calculate per play session descriptives like accuracy, speed, time on challenge, completion, et cetera, things like that. And then on to more compound or higher level ideas like proficiency and so forth, all in near time. And there's also a suite of metadata services that help you get any of the information about the media resources that you might need to help power some downstream application. And a suite of application services that power all of the tools that I'm going to show you a few of here in a minute. So I'll briefly touch on a few interesting features of each of the components here. This is the identity system. So this is designed with kids at the center of everything, right? It's got to be kid-friendly user experience. It uses audio prompts, things like visual codes for password retrieval, stuff like that. And in terms of safety, all text entry fields are moderated by a human. So everything is evaluated to make sure that there isn't any sensitive data collected or stored. And to support all the desired distribution platforms, PBS Kids provides drop-in kits to game producers that make integration of identity services a snap, one for each platform that we support. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the ID kit, the identity kit, supports anonymous or logged-in play sessions, can convert one to the other if you have to. We call that attribution transference, and that comes in handy whenever a kid is playing anonymously but maybe earns something that they want to save to their profile, so they log in the middle of a play session and we can refile that activity from the anonymous play session ID over to the logged in ID, that kind of thing. On the data collection side of things, we also provide a tracking kit. This makes integrating tracking capabilities much simpler than it otherwise would be. And the ID kit and the tracking kit are aware of each other. They sort of know how to use each other. For example, the tracking kit can ask the identity kit, who's playing right now? Things like that. Tracking kit also supports deep offline mode, So short or even extended periods offline don't result in lost data, you know, if you're going through the train tunnel, or maybe you only get your internet at the library every so often. Well, we're trying not to lose data if we can possibly avoid it. Tracking Kit also supports batch transmission. This reduces network activity, reduces load on CPU, especially on mobile devices, things that can affect the game performance. We kind of want to work through that, make that seamless. And we even give game producers the ability to control when batches are sent if they need direct control. But what is it that we're collecting? Okay, so first of all, the slide isn't intended to be legible, but it's intended to illustrate that a single game might have 20 to 30 different well-defined events to describe player or system level activity. Each one of those rows represents a particular kind of event that can be triggered by a game. And each of the columns represent all of the state of the game that can be transmitted along with that event. So we're capturing quite a bit of information. I mentioned earlier that, you know, we try to map the entire interaction space and then track the facts. Well, you know, in a game environment, the interaction paradigm can be pretty sophisticated, especially in, you know, simulation and so forth. So we really, you know, really want to make an architecture that works well for even the most robust user experiences. So just briefly, list some of the platforms we cover. We've got JavaScript for your standard and mobile user agents and plugin-based content. We've got Adobe Air and ActionScript that helps with some of our cross-platform published content. We've got iOS native and Objective-C. We've got Android native and Java, and Unity on C#. So we've got a pretty broad set of coverage capabilities in terms of what clients we can support if you're thinking about authoring a game for our system. The data store itself is built for scalability. It's cluster-based, which just means a lot of servers working together. So we can simply spin up a new one if we need more storage or if we need more write throughput, something like that. Also, all of them working together with some replication strategies means reliability. I can lose a few and not worry about losing data. I really don't want to lose any data. The processing system has got a couple interesting features. I already described how incoming data can trigger some of our near-time processing, but a data scientist can too. So, you know, the data that comes in is designed to be replayable. The raw transcript, time series events that come in, I can take that and stream it back through at any time, even through new hypotheses. If I were to develop some new bit of processing that represents some new line of thinking, I can go back historically and replay the data, compare the results of the existing processing with the new processing, see what value the comparisons hold. Okay, so that's a rundown of the major platform components. Hopefully you at least have an idea of what we're talking about here. So I want to just talk a little tool turkey here. I'll tell you about a few and I'll show you a few. We built a couple automated testing capabilities. I wanted to mention this because we call him Oscar the Grouch. That's a nod to our Sesame friends here. Oscar's job is to complain about anything he can find wrong with anything, basically perform system checks, just make sure everything's all right. We've been automating a lot of our deployment tasks so that we can spin up deployments to power a research study or to give some other entity compartmentalized access to their own set of functionality. Really useful. We've got a synthetic data generator. It understands the event specifications and probabilistically can generate event streams. This is really useful when we're putting new pieces of analysis in place on production and we want to put it through its paces before we've had a chance to launch the content in front of the real stream of eyeballs. This is a metadata admin. Just think of it as a CMS where you can administrate all of the game metadata like titles, descriptions. All of the curriculum framework stuff is modeled here. All of the processing stuff is modeled here. And all of the relationships between those entities is all easily administratable here. You can also manage the allowable events that each game supports. Here's the logging service. This is designed to expose a data stream to an interested party. And it doesn't have to be local. If I'm playing on my device and I gave you the right information, you could hook into my data stream and be sorting and filtering and grouping and whatever it is you need to do, exporting. This comes in really useful for testing and making sure that the media experiences are actually transmitting the data that you expect them to be transmitting, you know, based on what everybody's agreed on. I've got a data exploration environment. It's a place where a game producer or a data scientist can go to get easy access to the data or current implementations of the analysis It's got some ad hoc analysis tools too. It's basically a prototyping and fast exploration environment. You got a full Python programming environment, access to the data store, access to the analytics we have in place now, and you can create your own new code here if you want, organize it into blocks, run it manually, take a look at the output. And anything you can do in Python, any of the SciPy, NumPy, or PyLab, any kind of plotting, it's a place you can pull up a seed and start tinkering around and seeing what we've got under the hood. Comes in really handy. Still under development. We've got a computational modeling environment. So this is a relatively new development. I still think we've got some kinks to work out here, but the idea is that each of these dots is a unit of processing. They're factored down to the independent units if possible. And you can implement the pieces, and here's a place where you can control which pieces might need to trigger another set of downstream processing, and it's totally decoupled. And so, for example, when the, cobalt or purple dot in the center runs, it'll cause all the other pieces that are connected to it to run because it's providing some piece of processing or state that they can all take as input. And it's done with a pub/sub mechanism, so if anybody's interested in how that works, I'm happy to talk more about that later. And so on, but each of the dots gives you complete control over what processing happens. So you can get in here, you can muck with the code directly and see the results. So that's the rundown on tools, basically. Next, I'd like to acknowledge the West Ed team. In the audience, they conducted a number of preliminary studies with us during prototype stages. We looked into a number of things, including the quality of our proficiency detection algorithms, got some great learning about what we were doing well and where we had real opportunities for improvement. And the project is currently in the process of designing the next wave of studies. Okay, the future. We want to explore the feasibility of embedding targeted assessments into gameplay itself. What if we could administer these targeted assessment items in a non-intrusive way for the kids, using the characters, using voiceover, that kind of thing. But why? And I think the answer to that is it's time-consuming and it's expensive for us to do the recruiting and the IRB and the manual administration of assessments and the out-of-band analysis required to get a set of calibration data suitable for vetting some of our analytics algorithms. And so to support shorter iteration cycles, and long-term sustainability of the project, really, frankly, we think it's worth some thought into what it would take and if it would really get us what we need or what we want. So we're looking into that kind of thing. Another thing we're looking into, experimental modeling. What if we could model the concept of experiment itself at the platform layer? And so, it's all the things that we're all talking about doing. It's, swapping different versions of game behavior, swapping different versions of instruction, different population samples, and comparing effects. Scrutinizing different sequences, scrutinizing different timescales of media consumption or dosages, and looking closely at the differences that result. So, is there a way to actually do that at the platform level? I'm not sure. Looking into it, though. And I guess in general, I would say, what can we do to facilitate getting this kind of work done regularly for as low cost as possible? Okay, enough about the future. It's time to wrap. So to sum up, we're trying to integrate the qualitative and the quantitative analysis effectively, if we can, derive useful levels of summary from the data, and produce dependable results. And we're focused on learning about learning. We were trying to help us, ourselves improve the educational impact of our media experiences. And, as we continue to make progress, we'll be sizing up more and more interesting opportunities. And I'm really looking forward to learning about everything that you guys are doing. Thank you.
Super detailed, yes. It was an interesting exercise in bringing together people from the world of technology and engineering and ICT, who had quite different takes on what literacy would mean and what technology meant. So you really should look at that. The pilot has gone to the field, and standard setting will start fairly shortly. And it's going to be very interesting to see from the NAEP sampling what it is that it perhaps will tell us about where our students are with regard to technological literacy. So I want to share with you today a program made up of multiple projects which we have been working on. I've been working on it for the last 10 plus years, and my colleagues at Wested and I for the last 8. The Sim Scientist program is made up of a series of projects, and all of them are looking at the various affordances of simulations in science, either for promoting or assessing what it is that students know and can do in the area of science. The simulation environments are extraordinarily well positioned to help us in the area of science because there are many phenomena in science systems in the natural world that are not visible to the naked eye and therefore are quite difficult for students to understand. So we can model these dynamic science phenomena in action as we simulate the science environments. We're trying to create simulation-based assessments and curriculum supplements. They are not inexpensive to design, so we are trying to pick particularly where we think the affordances of the technology and the kinds of designs we bring to these assessments and instructional supplements can best make a difference within an ongoing curriculum. We have linked our work and aligned it with the next generation science standards, and as we do our research, we're particularly committed to collecting evidence, evaluation, outcome data about the impacts of some of the kinds of assessments that are embedded during instruction that are meant to be used formatively on student science learning, on the technical quality of some of the summative simulation-based assessments we've developed so that they could be considered credible components of a summative assessment system, how feasible these kinds of simulations are for teachers across a wide variety of schools to implement and make sense of with their students, and ultimately whether these can become components of a balanced state science assessment system that would no longer need to rely on the 40-item multiple choice test. We've developed 2 suites, are in the midst of developing 2 suites at the middle school level. In life science, we are attending to ecosystems, cells, human body systems, genetics, and evolution. Physical science, as you can see, force and motion, atoms and molecules, energy, and waves. Our theory and research base is quite rich and reaches back over decades of learning science research. We're particularly using the conceptualization and research of model-based learning, and we're doing that in 2 ways. One, helping to try to build assessments and instructional supplements that will help the students build a strong mental model of science systems in action and how real scientists go about investigating and learning from them. Secondly, we are building the simulation environments to be models of these phenomena, and we use a cross-cutting framework, a system model framework, where all systems have components, interacting parts, and then emergent system behavior. And we use this as a frame for both our design work and also to help build this schema in the heads of the students. We use evidence-centered design to try to provide a laser-like focus on the specification of what the student outcomes are in terms of the science core ideas, cross-cutting concepts and practices, how we can design the simulation tasks and environments and questions to which students respond so we are getting observable evidence and we don't have to try to retrofit this later after we've developed a very cute simulation, but gee, we wonder what it's teaching or what we're trying to learn about it, and also what the evidence model is that will help us to report back to the potential users. In cognitive science, we've pulled from the literature on learning science and also multimedia learning that informs both the way we're representing the science systems and also the kinds of interactions and cognitive demands that we ask students to engage in. So from cognitive science, we're looking at types of knowledge: declarative, procedural, schematic, strategic. We don't need to bother with just the facts. We're hoping that initially in the ongoing curriculum, students are coming into contact during the curriculum with learning core ideas and doing some of the basic kinds of inquiry skills. So by the time the teacher decides to insert an embedded assessment, they're putting Humpty Dumpty together, and we're looking at the integration of these core ideas and applying them within science and inquiry-based investigations. We're very much committed to engaging students in iterative and extended inquiry kinds of activities. So that's one thing we believe the technology is particularly suited for. For multimedia research, we've drawn as much as we can from research about how one has students focus in simulation environments and what's important, what's significant, how we minimize extraneous processing, how we help students in guiding their attention to important parts of the science phenomenon. We use cueing, signaling. We try to make sure we're doing things that are coherent and contiguous for the parts of the system they're paying attention to, progressive complexity, and very importantly, user control and taking advantage of an interactive modality rather than just static recognition. These are the next generation standards, and they deal with these cross-cutting concepts as well as core ideas within each of the science disciplines and the science practices. I won't go over those with you now. There's a lovely science framework and next generation science standards that go into detail. We begin our design work with developing what we call a target model, where we take the parts of the ecosystem model, or the model for any system, atoms and molecules, human body systems. We look at the components, we look at the interactions and the kinds of emergent system behavior that are aligned with the grade band in the next generation science standards, and we take this generic model and then apply it to what is being called for in the standards, and looking therefore at what are our targeted core ideas, aka content, and what are our targeted science practices that we want to be sure we're going to be assessing. Our task models are, first of all, the simulation environments, and this is where we use this framework: components, interactions, emergent behavior of the science phenomenon, and what it is that the experts in the field of science and science education feel are appropriate ways of representing force and motion, or the human body systems, or cellular processes for the particular grade range. We develop two kinds of assessments. The benchmark assessments are at the end of a unit of instruction and are meant to see if kids can put Humpty Dumpty together by the end of a unit on, say, ecosystems or cells or force and motion. These are meant to last for one period and take the students through a problem-based simulation. The embedded assessments are developed depending on the scope of the particular unit for either 2 or 3 insertions as the teacher decides that the basic material has been covered and it's time to see how students can apply these in a simulation-based inquiry environment. And they also last 1 period each. During the embedded assessment is when we try to make these as useful as formative assessment resources as we can. We recognize the teachers are grandly adroit at monitoring every student's mind every single moment during the hour class period for all 30 students for all 5 shows a day. I was a middle school teacher. I can assure you that that was no problem. So within the assessments themselves, we provide some formative feedback and coaching so that we can provide diagnostic information to the teachers and the students. They get immediate feedback. That feedback is is based on algorithms on which we automatically score student responses. We also have some self-assessment involved when they're asked to generate explanations and various kinds of constructed responses which are not well auto-scored yet. And I wish the auto-scoring people would move along and help us out here. We'll try it out anytime you've got something to auto-score, those short little 10-word extended explanations from our students, by all means, please contact me and we'll be your research base. And the students in this case receive criteria for their explanations. They look at their explanations again. They're asked if they want to reconsider and revise their explanation, and then they have a model explanation to compare. So we're producing some metacognitive self-assessment skills as well. The coaching and the feedback are customized. They're graduated, so they receive increasingly more directive hints. And then at the end of the report that's generated in each embedded assessment, there are both progress reports on each of the content and each of the inquiry targets, and also recommendations for the teacher at the class level about kinds of grouping that might be helpful for a follow-up offline reflection activity in which students work on yet another example. In the case of ecosystems, they might move from the mountain lake in the simulation to the tundra, and the kinds of simpler and more complex tasks that will speak to the profile of the class. Our evidence model includes these auto-scored tasks, the constructed responses on the benchmark assessment in which we use a BaseNet, and also rubrics for teachers to score the constructed responses. We have an online rater training and scoring system that works very well. And then we report the scores out by the standard for the core ideas and the practices. And in the embedded assessments, as I said, we do these progress reports. So this is where the implementation, this is what the implementation looks like. We have regular instruction. Whoops, well, there it was. And now you get to see one. All right, never mind. We'll just go back here for a minute. So we have regular instruction, embedded assessment and reflection activity, more regular instruction as the teacher teaches more about the concepts in the unit, another embedded assessment, simulation-based, and then finally the benchmark assessment at the end. So just to give you an idea what one of these looks like, this is an example of very quick time movie excerpting what they do when they see an ecosystems problem-based assessment where there's been a fire in the grasslands and it needs to be restored. So first student says, good little scientists, watch who's eating what and whom, and so they can understand what the components of the ecosystem are and who's playing the role of producer and consumer. After they go through identifying a number of those things, then the culminating signature task for this 45-minute one, where they're receiving various kinds of feedback, which you can't read too well here, but trust me, it's dazzling. And we use highlighting and various ways to help them. Why did that do that? That's so rude. I said, don't mess with me. I designed this thing. Come on. Here you go. Come on, you can do it. Watch them eat that. Look at that. That poor kookaburra. That lizard. That little girl cried when they beat up the lizard and ate him because she had a pet lizard. I tell you, it was a sad thing. So much for bias, you know. It serves her right. Who keeps lizards anyway? So SimSci, my cat loves them. SimScientist assessment in the population level, one of the affordances that's really important is that they can run these multiple simulation-based investigations and save them and then interpret the data. So that gives you an idea what some of them look like. So what are our technology affordances? Why are these simulations so important, and how is it that we would want to go forward and build the kinds of SimScientist games that would help students to engage in the predator-prey game and things like that in order to extend this rich resource base? Well, we have animations of the dynamic systems already in action, and they can review these and look at them again. It doesn't take a whole lot to figure out how to do that with game kinds of tasks. They can do multiple trials, they can save trials, they can use a data inspector to look at population levels or reading graphs and charts. We have multiple overlaying simultaneous representations, very important to help reinforce students' understanding of these concepts and get rid of, can they read a chart? Well, that's not my problem, that's the teacher's problem. I want to know if they can apply the data from the chart in order to reason with it. We use the highlighting and the zoom and the drawing, as you may have seen. So these multiple modes of representation are very important, and ones that we try to take advantage of in terms of cognitive support. So we generate reports, progress reports from the embedded assessments. Again, the teacher is meant to use these formatively. They say that the students need help or are progressing or are on track. No numbers, no grading can be done. And then the benchmark reports are based on the standards and our proficiency reports. We've conducted an extensive amount of research over the years in our funding projects, both from NSF and from IES. We have tried out 2 of the assessment suites in 2 states with 26 teachers and not quite 4,000 students, where we looked at a small randomized trial of students in classes where they use the embedded assessment, then the benchmark and a post-test, or they use just the benchmark, and lo and behold, thank the dear Lord, that formative assessment does in fact help improve learning because they're getting more practice and more feedback. So that's one more set of evidence for those of you looking for formative assessment data. These things can be feasibly implemented by a wide variety of teachers. We've worked with more than 80 teachers in 12 states implementing these in middle school classrooms. And despite the hue and cry about teachers don't understand and they can't do it and they're going to be freaked out, not so. They can and make their way also through the school firewalls and things of that sort. So we, CRESST, in fact, conducted an evaluation of the feasibility of 2 of the suites with 3 states, 28 districts, 39 schools, 55 teachers, and about 5,500 kids. So the implementation has been pretty well debugged. And we feel confident that we can, in developing more and more of these, be able to do so using our task templates and our design approach. Most important, well, one of the important things is that these benchmark assessments do have technical quality. We do IRT, we do Bayes nets analysis, you name it, and it's been run through the ringer. And they work pretty well at all acceptable levels for being able to be reported as a summative measure. So you can imagine a balanced state assessment system where you had not 42-item test, but you had reports from the simulation-based end-of-unit tests for each of your units in, say, an earth science or a life science year curriculum. A lot more information on which we can base ways to improve instruction. So we think that there's a lot of promise. So this is what a balanced assessment system might look like, building from the bottom up from rich research-based tasks until, if you'll pardon my saying so, the highly impoverished. You start with building a simulation or a test at the state level. Quite often you're so limited by time and economics and this, that, and the other thing that by the time you get through, you have a very frippy looking simulation, where in point of fact, if you start from the rich kind of learning environments you want from the classroom level and build up, you have a chance of building things we call signature tasks, where you could do 5 to 7 minutes of short ICT kinds of NAEP-like tasks and get a lot of information on a state test in a spiraled way in order to get more information about what students know and can do. So we think the signature task model is something that's promising moving forward in the large-scale assessment field. This last slide has a set of publications, one of which, by the way, won an award, thank you, as the best research article of the year for the Journal of Research on Science Teaching, in the Journal of Ed Psych and Ed Assessment, and a lot of different areas. So I believe that our research base in terms of both methodologies and findings can be very helpful in helping to support that these kinds of simulation-based assessments, in fact, have a lot of promise. And if you have questions, how's that, huh? Down to like the last second. Oh, God, it's frightening. So you can write either on the website if you want to see more examples. We have the papers up there. We have samples of the simulation-based assessments and also ones that have been turned into instructional supplements with a little more support and introduction. Or you can write me and we'll be happy to see if any of you are interested in collaborating. If you have teachers who want to try this, because we have new ones coming out. If you're interested in looking at different ways of doing analyses, we have lots of data. And just really interested in helping to move this field forward where we have richer, better assessments. Thank you.
Okay, so actually what I'm going to talk about is a project called the Open Learning Initiative, which started at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm just curious about the prior knowledge in the audience. Who has heard of the Open Learning Initiative? Okay, great, then I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about it, and I can talk about what's next more. So, but for those who haven't heard of the Open Learning Initiative, it was a project that we started at Carnegie Mellon in 2002. It was funded originally by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the goal was to create open, web-based learning environments to support independent learners out there in the world who didn't have access to a high-quality post-secondary education. So the basic idea was, if you were out there as a learner and you wanted to learn statistics, because as the Hewlett Foundation knew, that is a natural human drive. Just want to learn statistics. Could we develop an environment, yes, could we develop an environment that would support you as an independent learner just working with a computer to achieve the same learning goals as we would have expected of a student sitting in a traditional statistics course at Carnegie Mellon? So that was the original design goal. And basically, so what we created were open online learning environments that were sat at the integration of learning research and what the technology could do. And they were designed both to instantiate what we know about human learning, but also to serve as great big laboratories for further studying human learning, in partnership with another project that was a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center, or LearnLab, which Vincent was a principal in. So that's what OLI was. And so I'll just give you a quick little example. When we talk about what do I mean by use learning science to design the environment, West Ed just gave you a great description of that, so I'm not going to spend pretty much any time going into that because you did a much better, more detailed job than I was going to in my limited time. But basically, some of the ideas were we didn't spend our time developing a lot of lectures or written material. We spent our time, as West Ed has done, really thinking about the learning activities in which the learner could engage and the kinds of hints and support and feedback in the context of the learning process that we could give the students to support their learning. And this was based on work that had been done for 15 or 20 years at Carnegie Mellon in the area of cognitive tutors, which are pieces of software that are intended to act like a good human tutor. They're there to support the student when the student asks for help, to give feedback to the student when the student needs it, or otherwise just kind of hang back and let the student perform. But in addition to doing cognitive tutors, we also recognize that it's more than just, especially at the higher education level, just building procedural fluency. So much as West Ed described, we also built scenarios in which the learning was to occur. For example, in our chemistry course, we situated the learning of stoichiometry in the real-world problem of the arsenic contamination of the water supply in Bangladesh. And so the students open the experience, they get a quick documentary, and then they get put in the role of chemist. And they're given a well water sample from a theoretical well in Bangladesh and asked, is this water safe to drink? When they analyze the sample, they're told how many moles of arsenic are in solution. And the World Health Organization tells them 10 micrograms per liter of arsenic is safe to drink. So just to even answer that first question, they have to do the conversion between moles and micrograms per liter. If they can do that, they move on. If not, then they get the just-in-time learning experience that supports them using the tutoring, worked examples, and so on in how to do that dimensional analysis. When they move on, then the next bit of information they get is about a Bangladeshi chemist who has developed a filtration system using local clays. but of course the absorptive capacity of the clay varies because it's a natural substance. So they have to analyze the absorptive capacity of the clay, look at the level of arsenic in the water, and answer the question, how often would a family need to change this filter to keep their water safe to drink? So they're learning the skills in the context of a real-world problem. Okay, so that's just a really quick overview, but I want to ask you guys a question because you've been sitting there quietly for quite some time. So we talked about today many of the affordances of this technology. So I'm curious what you think the big power is that's going to sort of solve or crack the higher education problem. So I've got 3 pictures here, and I'm going to ask you to vote. So get ready. The first one is simulation. So I'm not going to describe any further because we had a great description of the power of simulation and what you can do in these environments. So simulation. The second one is what you hear a lot about, especially with MOOCs, access and convenience. With a computer, you can learn anytime, any place. The third one is connection. These computers are connected to an internet, which means we can connect learners to other information, to other experts, to each other, to the world. So I'm going to ask you, which one do you think is the big power? Is it simulation, access and convenience, or connection? Okay, how many vote for simulation? I'm expecting you to raise your hand. Yeah, simulation. Okay, great. How many people think it's access and convenience? Anytime, any place learning. Okay. How many people think it's connectivity? Yeah, that one's always getting more press now. Now, I notice not everyone raised their hand. How many of you are just the kind of people who don't raise your hand when you're asked to raise your hand? Okay. No, because some people say, okay, Candace, it's a bad multiple choice question, because what I really want to say is all of the above. How many wanted to say all of the above? Okay, and then my assessment person always tells me, you're not supposed to give this as an option, none of the above. Okay, so yeah, it is a bad, I knew Vincent was going to raise his hand. The truth is, they're all important, but actually, I am going to side with Vincent, surprise, surprise, that it's actually not the most critical feature of these environments. What I would put to you is the most critical feature of these environments is what we've actually been talking about today. And it's actually what Google has figured out. It's what Netflix has figured out. It's what Amazon has figured out. The power of these environments is not pushing stuff out, but pushing stuff to the interface. Because in the interface, we can observe. Now, Google, Netflix, Amazon, they're observing us as consumers so that they can figure out better how to target us as consumers and understand us better individually and collectively. Using that same idea, we can observe learners to understand that individual learner better so that we can target the learning better to meet that learner's needs, but also better to understand learners collectively. So we can use that to inform the design of our environments. And we call that our killer app. And that is this idea of collecting the student data to drive these powerful feedback loops. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but I want to say just a little something about data collection, which is you hear a lot about big data and collecting data. Unfortunately, a lot of the environments that are collecting big data are not collecting data that's very useful for understanding human learning. To collect the data that's really useful for understanding human learning, you have to kind of design the environment and instrument it with that intention to begin with, much as we heard about WestEd doing. So with that data, we can drive these feedback loops. One is to the learner. The other really important feedback loop is to the instructor. So rather than telling the instructor how many problems a person got right, we can use this data to drive an underlying model and tell the instructor by learning outcomes where their students are. So this is just a snapshot out of an instructor learning dashboard. This is out of our statistics course because of that passion to learn statistics. So what this tells you is, I don't know if you can read those outcomes, but there are, as everyone has talked about, phrased in terms of the student, student-centered and observable. So, for example, we have the outcome that says, relate the measure of center and spread to the shape of the distribution and choose the appropriate measure in different contexts. So now what that bar is telling the instructor is that's a bar that represents their class. So the students that are in green, we would predict if you were to give the students an assessment today, they would nail it. The students in orange, we would predict that if you were to give them an assessment, they do moderately okay. And in red, we would predict that they would not do very well at all. What about gray? Anybody got a guess? Yeah, they haven't done enough work in the system for us to make any kind of reliable prediction. So the instructor, you can see how the instructor could use that information to make a decision about how am I going to spend my class time today? What am I going to focus on? If that's not enough information and they got more time, they can drill down and look at not just what's the distribution of my students, but who are those students. Each dot represents a student, and I removed the student names, but if you were the instructor, you'd get to see them. And then how many activities the student engaged in that's driving that prediction. I can also look at that larger outcome has multiple sub-skills or sub-concepts. And so I can also look at the distribution of performance on those sub-skills. So the challenge that my students might be having in relating the the measures of center and spread to the shape of the distribution might be because they're struggling with, say, computing the median. And so I can target in on that. And I want to make one more point, which I think was sort of touched on before, which is when we say that we can make a prediction about the student being able to compute the median, what we have not done is simply said to the student, okay, compute the median now. Here are 10 arrays of numbers. Compute the median 8 out of 10 times, and we'll say you can compute the median. Because that's not what we really mean when we want to know if a student can compute the median. What we really mean is, when the student's sort of bumping along, trying to do interesting things in the world, do they recognize when computing the median is something that will help them make traction on the larger problem they're working on? So do they recognize when to compute the median? Once they recognize it, can they do it? Or do they compute the mode instead? Or do they make an arithmetic mistake computing the median? And then once they do that, can they take that answer and use it to move forward on the original reason they were interested in computing the median? And we can do all that without flagging to the student, we're assessing right now whether you can compute the median. Because we can just tag that activity at that sub-step with that compute the median component without having to signal to the student whether that's what we're assessing. So that data goes to the student, to the instructor, and then the courses that we're developing are used in multiple classrooms. Like last quarter, the statistics course was used in 60 different institutions of a variety of Carnegie classifications. And so the design team, the course design team, which is made up of multiple faculty domain experts, learning researchers, universal design for learning experts, human-computer interaction experts, software engineers, that come together to collectively design these environments. And they also get the data from all of the courses, say in statistics, that we're running last quarter. And the last feedback loop is to the science of learning. As I said, we partnered very heavily with the Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center, and so they get the data from multiple courses to be able to make meta-level inferences about human learning. So it was all very cool, and we did some cool stuff. We applied the science of learning to the research. We developed interactive learning activities. We used feedback loops for continuous improvement, and we built this community of use and evaluation to continuously build and extend the courses. So you might say, sounds great. What difference does it make? Well, we did a bunch of studies. The two that probably got the biggest press, again, I'll stick in statistics. One was this accelerated learning study that we did, that we demonstrated that students we had students in two conditions. In the regular condition, they took a 15-week statistics course, 4 class meetings a week. In the accelerated condition, they completed the course in 8 weeks with 2 class meetings a week, so half the elapsed time, a quarter of the instructor contact hours, and the students in the accelerated condition did as well or better than the students in the traditional condition. And we replicated that study 3 times with different instructors and different class sizes. And then Bill Bowen, the former president of Princeton and of the Mellon Foundation, did a similar study, but not with as much acceleration, only a 25% acceleration in multiple public institutions in several state systems. Okay, so did some cool stuff, but there were some real limits in what we were doing in OLI version 1.0. The one that's pinches me the most is that the O in the Open Learning Initiative stood for open, or stands for open, not online. And so all of the courses that we developed were openly licensed with Creative Commons licenses. Unfortunately, the platform which we developed to run the courses, we did not open source. And that was actually a conscious decision I made 10 years ago, because I was concerned that if I made it an open source platform, I'd find myself in the middle of running a big open source software project. And so, which I didn't want to focus the time there. So we're in a situation now where the courses are openly licensed, but the platform is closed and proprietary. So the courses are currently in a state where they are legally open, but they're practically not. But I'm fixing that. The other thing is that we didn't put a lot of time and energy into building authoring tools. Some of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon did build some great authoring tools, like Vincent did on some cognitive tutor authoring tools, and there were other tools, but not direct OLI authoring tools. And we had limited tools for doing the data visualization. The learning researchers could understand those visualizations, but mere mortals was a little more challenging. And then for most of the learning science that we used was cognitive science. And as folks who work a lot with kids, you recognize there are many other factors that contribute to student success than just what's happening cognitively. And then finally, our focus was on the individual learner, not so much on the networked learning environments. And we did primarily STEM courses. So, how to address the limits of OLI version 1.0? OLI version 2.0. Which now started at Stanford University. I want to be clear that that doesn't mean OLI ceased to exist at Carnegie Mellon. We just have a strong research collaboration now, development collaboration between Carnegie Mellon and Stanford, which expands both the development capacity and the research capacity. And the goal is the same, to use the learning science to transform higher education. But we have kind of a slightly different model. So one of the things is that we're building into, Stanford made an agreement with edX to do a software development partnership under the condition that all the software that edX developed and all the software that Stanford developed for edX is open source. So, and they created OpenEdX, which is an open source platform. So we're building into the OpenEdX platform the functionality that we had in the OLI platform, and as soon as we complete that, we'll be able to pull the OLI courses over, and they'll exist in both places, in a commercial proprietary platform for folks who want that, but also in an open source, open community platform. We are also partnering with researchers at Stanford who look at many aspects of learning, like Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat, Carol Dweck's work, which our lunchtime speaker was talking about. Carol is my colleague at Stanford, looking at mindset and how we design environments to support growth mindset. Jeff Cohen's work on belongingness, and on and on and on. So really bringing these other theoretical models to inform the design of the learning. And then, of course, the big energy at Stanford, at Carnegie Mellon, many places, is to use the data to drive also our understanding. So using our lunchtime speaker was speaking a little bit about this too, using machine learning, educational data mining, and so on. The difference is bringing them together so that we have theories that we can create testable hypotheses, as well as using the data mining and machine learning techniques to look at the relationships in the data, and have both those be informed by the expertise of the subject matters to create these both explanatory and predictive models on which we can design the environments. And this brings me to my belief about how technology will transform higher education. And that is, we have to set up this virtuous cycle, which is, we need to design these educational technologies based on our best understanding now of human learning, on our best theory. We use the technology for what it's really good for, which is great big data collectors, and we collect the data, analyze the data to refine our theories of human learning and our models of students. And then we use those refined theories and models to redesign our educational technology. And we set up this virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. But what that will require is, this doesn't exist, this Creative Commons license for open data doesn't exist, but we think it should. And we are convening folks around the whole question of open data and data privacy. But I'm going to close with a quote from Herb Simon, who was at Carnegie Mellon, who said back in 1991, improvement in post-secondary education will require converting teaching from a solo sport to a community-based research activity. And that is the endeavor that I am inviting multiple institutions from across the country to participate in. That's it.
Well, thank you, Greg. But actually, I am Eva Baker. This is the second time in 2 weeks where, because of Eva was out sick with a respiratory syndrome, that I had to stand and either give her talk or to say things about research, which in fact that she started. And as I mentioned earlier today, that my involvement with CRESST was a fairly recent event, and for me, this is such a huge learning experience as well. So she's got the more interesting slides, and the ones at the end are all mine, so all the errors or omissions or the boringness would be mine alone. And, okay, so we're talking about, in LA, businesses about images. We see new versions and the hot colors of the year, and these images drew our eye, and we project ourselves onto. And then, which one of these will last? And to build something that will last, in the end, I think that we would need to have known specifications. We've heard throughout today, and especially during lunch, and as well as from this session, that it is not merely sufficient to be out there collecting large volumes of data and dumping feedback from the data in front of the instructional team or in front of the students, but rather this would require a very serious investigation and front-end analysis of the infrastructure to make meaning out of the data. And then quality of either learning systems or assessment systems are not going to be able to be attributed upon at the end, but rather paying homage to Bob Mislevy, who's sitting at the back, and his evidence-centered design framework, that it really has to be designed from within, from the first step. And learning from CATS and PowerSource, which is the prior IES center focusing on formative assessment, these two assessment-related center awards really dawned on me. When I got to UCLA, what really dawned on me was that there's a great importance of infrastructure in the design of assessments, of games, of looking at documentation of evidence of validation. And in some ways that, if you talk to architects without the specification of structure, of the functional relationships and intended outcomes, you would not be able to sustain and document the quality of the building. And here, of course, building would mean our games, our assessment systems, our learning systems. And the real breakthrough, I think, coming out of CATS, at least the way I see it, and I'm not speaking for you, Greg, is really an integration of the qualitative approaches and the quantitative approaches. So we've had cognitive models for assessments and development of assessments and interventions, these ontologies that we have seen developed for a variety of different contexts, problem solving, ontologies for metacognition, for communication, and in CATS, our goal was to develop and evaluate educational learning games intended to improve students' knowledge and skills in these well-defined topic areas, pre-algebra topics, rational numbers, fractions, solving equations, so on and so forth, and then run a efficacy trial to test it. But before getting to the efficacy part, we spend a lot of time doing the front-end analysis. And while this is a shameless advertisement for my own session tomorrow, yes, it does work, but it requires additional ways of looking at the data. So when we began, we developed these ontologies. Each one of these would be nodes that are connected. So you get to zoomed in view of the 5th and 6th grade topics related to arithmetic operations, fractions, and equations, so on and so forth. And this then became the background knowledge so that we could begin to develop these very detailed knowledge specifications, which then run through everything. We use these knowledge specifications to, of course, use them to write items so that the items would assess the combinations of those knowledge attributes. Certain items are requiring more than 2, more than 3 of these attributes in a conjunctive or disjunctive way, and diagnostic classification models may then be fit to those item responses. But also in games, the game features themselves are derived directly from those knowledge specifications, and in addition to that, we also use the same knowledge specifications to derive professional development material so that when the teacher in a classroom, because these are classroom-based interventions, when they're going to implement this in the classroom, they would have somewhere to start, and the scaffolding is on the same kind of specifications. This, from a design perspective, enabled us to, in the end, when we do the psychometric analysis and the estimation of impact, to be able to say, given this intervention, what are some of the components that are not easily malleable in this short 12, 15 days of instructional period versus those that could be changed. And the reason we could identify those was because we have very stable control condition. And once those are pulled out, you will get these estimated latent change values, which are much more sensitive to the detection of differences. So let's say if you used standard approaches and you have very good items, you've done all of the IRT analysis to verify that they're good, and then at the end you add the items up using weights that are either defined by fiat or using psychometric analysis. You're not getting at that deeper level of connection back into what this knowledge specification would allow you to do, because the knowledge specifications are asking things that I think are really functional. You know, does a student understand the importance of a unit whole? And one of the things that we found through looking at process data when the kids were playing these games was that that was one of the most difficult things, that they have to figure out that they're talking about dividing a whole unit into equal length intervals. And once that step is passed, you get all the rest. So this applies in a more general way, and in thinking about sort of computational models that would try to extract meaning out of process data, for example. Essentially, this is very schematic. Eventually the model, when it comes out for any specific instance, may not have to look like this. But you know, essentially going down from the raw examinee or test taker or respondent or student behavior, these would be the very detailed data that, for example, in PBS Kids' case, that they would be able to collect from the website interactions. And then there are these extractions, the functions that would take these detailed features, either through purely exploratory machine learning approaches or perhaps through guidance in supervised approaches to compute these functions so that we could combine the events and states into feature layer. And these features then give us the indicators which we then may be able to use in standard statistical models that would allow us, and usually with Bayesian flavor, to allow us to make inferences about mastery of skills. And if those skills make up a domain or a subdomain, then we could also talk about the progression of students' learning on that particular domain or subdomain. And then also that you will also possibly be able to introduce additional ancillary variables that look at background differences, prior knowledge, and even using very simple assessment items that are of multiple choice type to get at those, and then to help your learning about the student's performance. This we have applied in completely different contexts, not in the context of education, but rather in mental health and behavioral health. This is a study that's funded by DARPA, which began as the Healing Heroes project, and I'm looking at Roy. There you are, who's going to lead us the fitness run. That this was one of the projects that he served as project director on, and the idea is still very simple, that the military is interested in looking at the assessment, early warning signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression-related events, and the technology that they're using are based on cell phone data collection, so that you could mine the text messages, you could use voice analysis. BBN Cogito has voice analysis, and you would also be able to couple that with a standard survey or questionnaire type of psychiatric assessment instruments to try to get a sense of whether there's an increased probability of some PTSD or depression-related event that's coming up online. And at the end, the idea is still very much the same. We have very well developed domain ontologies, because PTSD has certain definition, let's say according to DSM. Whether it's the greatest definition or not, we're not sure. We're not content experts in that. Psychiatrists seem to have agreed that that is a usable definition. So we're going to use that to generate the domain ontology and define those feature layer and events, how they aggregate up eventually to a prediction. So I think that this is something that really has taught us through, or taught me through playing in this field of learning games and learning analytics. At the end of the day, as I probably have said to some of you, during breaks, that I think that we should probably try to get better definitions of words. When people say psychometrics, it become a loaded word in these contexts to mean the classic way of doing item analysis and scale transformations, linking studies, and the standard IRT models that are highly unidimensional, that would not give you the kind of functional feedback that's important for learners and instructional improvement. But at the end of the day, what I think most of my psychometric friends would agree, that psychometrics is really about defining these models, looking at hard to measure latent variables, constructs that you don't easily have direct behavioral correspondence, and then we would require an articulation of the claims that you're going to make about the output of the systems, and then look at what you know about the domain, and look at what you have as the behavior or evidence performance from these tasks, simulations, assessments, and then put them all together using statistical means. And a few months ago, I was giving a presentation on a similar topic, but to a much more statistical audience, and Steve Rodenbush, who did a lot of work in the area of hierarchical linear modeling, but recently grew very interested in learning science, made an interesting comment that essentially that these days, with more complicated psychometric models that require domain definitions, ontologies, and knowledge specifications, the psychometricians are saying that we have the tools. We could actually estimate these models. We're putting the task to you guys, the learning scientists, the curriculum developers. Be very specific. Give us something that we could turn into mathematical equations. And then we might be able to give you some information. Now, that would not be perfect first go around. But if we iterate, we may be able to derive better meaning next time, and then hopefully that information will be useful to you. So thank you very much.